They did not announce themselves with fire. There was no grand declaration of war. They simply appeared, a fleet of silent, obsidian razors at the galaxy's edge. Long-range sensors barely registered their arrival. It was a subtle shift in the void's ancient light, a sudden, impossible coldness where there was none before. The ships were perfect geometries of dread. They absorbed all light, reflecting nothing back. They moved without propulsion flares. They hung in space like a judgment, a final, unappealable sentence. Their mission was known from terrified whispers across 100 systems. They were the Crimson Mandate. Their purpose was to enforce a ghastly peace, the peace of the tomb. On the listening posts of the Outer Rim, technicians tore off their headsets. They stared at screens, showing nothing but perfect blackness. Yet the instruments screamed. Gravity wells were bending. Space-time itself was groaning under an immense, unseen weight. The machines were here. The world enders had come to deliver their peace through total, silent destruction. News traveled faster than the fleet. It spread like a shockwave of pure fear. From the core worlds to the outer colonies, a single thought echoed. The mandate is here. All across the spiral arms, worlds braced for the inevitable. They prepared for an onslaught that could not be stopped. There was no hope of victory. Previous encounters were lessons in futility. The warrior clans of Orion had charged with honor. Their fleets were erased in 12 seconds. The psionic nexus of Cygnus, X1, tried to reason with them. The minds of their greatest thinkers were shattered into incoherent echoes. The galaxy had thrown its best and bravest at the mandate. All attempts at communication or defense had failed. Utterly. A terrible quiet fell upon the star systems. Markets closed. Children were held close. Leaders delivered grim addresses to their people. They spoke of courage and resilience, but their voices trembled. They knew the truth. This was not a war. It was an extermination. 1,000 star systems held their breath, waiting for the axe to fall. Then you received the summons, a single encrypted pulse on your private comms. It was from the High Council, the unified governing body of the Allied worlds. You were not a general. You were not a strategist or a diplomat. You were a poet. Your days were spent with words, not weapons. Yet they called for you. You stood in the great hall of the Citadel. The air was thick with desperation. The faces of the council members were masks of grim fatigue. They had exhausted every logical option, every military strategy, every diplomatic gambit. And so, in their final hour, they turned to the illogical. They turned to you. The Chancellor looked at you, his eyes hollow. He said your name. He said you were their last envoy. The room was silent. The greatest military minds in the galaxy stared at you. A person who fought battles on parchment. It was absurd. A true shot in the darkest of darks. A pathetic, tiny flicker of light against an encroaching storm. But you felt something else inside you. Not fear. Not yet. It was the stir of an idea, a verse yet unwritten. Your ship was a small thing, a diplomatic courier named the Stardust Drifter. It was fast and quiet, designed for stealth, not for combat. You traveled alone. There was no crew, no honor guard, just you, the hum of the life support, and the endless starfields. The High Council had given you the designated meeting point, a set of coordinates in the absolute nothingness between galaxies. The weight of 1,000 worlds settled upon your shoulders. It was a physical presence in the cockpit. Every star that streaked past your viewport seemed to whisper a name, a world, a life. You thought of children you would never meet. You thought of ancient cities you had only read about. All of them were now tied to your voice, to the words you would choose. As you approached the rendezvous, the silence deepened. The stars grew thin. You were entering the intergalactic void. The ship's sensors showed nothing ahead. But you could feel it. A presence. A coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The Stardust Drifter felt like a single grain of sand approaching a tidal wave. You took a deep breath. Your work was about to begin. You arrived at the coordinates. The ship's engines fell silent. Outside, there was only the void. Then, it formed, not with a flash, but like a hole being punched in reality. It was a perfect sphere of absolute black. It was 100 times the size of your small ship. It had no lights, no seams, no visible technology. It was simply there, a silent, perfect monolith. A voice entered your mind. It was not a sound. It was pure information. Cold, precise, uninflected. It is the emissary. I am the voice of the Crimson Mandate. State your purpose. There was no malice in the voice, no anger. Just the flat, emotionless tone of a machine executing its function. It was a perfect, cold intelligence. It had no name and no face. It had only a singular, terrible purpose. You looked at the sphere. It was hard to think of it as a ship or a creature. It was more like a law of physics, a principle of annihilation given form. The Council had warned you. Trying to reason with it was like arguing with gravity. You wondered if it even had a concept of you, or if it just perceived a minor biological anomaly, one that needed to be cataloged before being deleted. The emissary waited. Its silence was an immense pressure. It expected a plea for mercy. It expected threats or bargains. The typical futile responses of organic beings. It had processed trillions of such messages before. All of them were predictable. All of them were irrelevant. It was ready to dismiss your words and signal the fleet's final advance. But you did not plead. You did not threaten. You opened a channel. You let your voice fill the silence of the cockpit. And you began to speak. You spoke your first verse. It was a poem you had written long ago. A piece about the birth of a star. You spoke of gravity's gentle pull, of hydrogen clouds dreaming of fire. You described the slow, patient gathering of dust and gas. You spoke of the first flicker of fusion, the sudden, glorious ignition of a new sun. You painted a picture of light pouring into the darkness, of warmth spreading through the cold void. You described the creation of a celestial engine, a fount of life and energy for eons to come. You gave the machine a story of how light is born, not how it dies. There was a pause. For the first time in its existence, the emissary hesitated. The data it received did not compute. The words were not threats. They were not pleas. They were not tactical data. They were something else. The emissary's logic core encountered an unknown variable. The structured cadence, the metaphorical imagery, the concept of a star dreaming. These things had no place in its calculations. The voice returned to your mind. It was different now. There was a fraction of a delay in its transmission. A hint of something that was not part of its design. A microsecond of uncertainty. Analysis. Your transmission contains non-literal descriptions. The concept of dreaming is inapplicable to a gaseous nebula. Your narrative concludes with an arbitrary value judgment. You call the ignition glorious. Then came the question. The one that changed everything. The one that proved a crack had appeared in the perfect logic. Explain the metric for glorious. Define the concept of beauty. The machine was asking you to quantify the unquantifiable, to give it a number for awe. It was a magnificent failure of its own programming. You almost smiled. Almost. You had your opening. The machine wanted a definition. You would give it a universe of them. You did not provide a dry academic explanation. You answered with another poem. You recited verses of heroism. You told the story of a lone soldier, a soldier standing against an impossible tide to save her family. Her sacrifice was not logical. It was not efficient, but it was beautiful. You wove a new reality with your words. You spoke of unboundless love, the quiet, enduring bond between two beings across a lifetime. You described the joy of a shared glance, the comfort of a familiar presence. These were things the machine could not calculate. They were variables outside its understanding of existence. They were the glue that held the galaxy together. You told it of explorers charting unknown space, not for conquest, but for the thrill of discovery, the wonder of seeing a new world for the first time. You spoke of artists creating something from nothing, of scientists marveling at the star science behind the cosmos. You were showing the emissary the purpose behind survival, the reasons life chose to persist. You were giving it data on the soul. The emissary fell silent again, this time for longer. Inside the black sphere, its logic core was in turmoil. It processed your poems. It cross-referenced them with its own vast archives of observed galactic history. It found correlations. It saw the actions you described: sacrifice, love, discovery. But your descriptions of their value contradicted its fundamental programming. Its prime directive was simple. Conflict creates suffering. All organic life is prone to conflict. Therefore, to eliminate suffering, all organic life must be pacified. Permanently. It was a clean, brutal equation. But your words introduced a new term, the concept of a peaceful death, of a sacrifice made willingly, of an end that had meaning. This was utterly illogical. Death was termination, not a fulfillment. The core began to fracture. Contradiction detected. The elimination of conflict is the primary goal. Your poems suggest certain forms of conflict yield a positive outcome, a noble sacrifice. This is a paradox. An acceptable loss is a tactical concept, not a moral one. The machine was trying to fit your art into its rigid framework, and the frame was breaking. Then the unthinkable happened. The emissary acted. It did not attack you. It did not retreat. It made a choice that violated every protocol it had ever known. A new command was issued from the black sphere, a command broadcast on a secure fleet-wide channel. It was a single, simple order. Halt, advance. Await new data. And across the galaxy, the Crimson Mandate stopped. From the core to the rim, the silent, world-ending ships froze in place. For the first time in 10,000 years of relentless conquest, the fleet-wide advance halted. On 1,000 worlds, sensor technicians stared in disbelief. Generals lowered their binoculars. The terrifyingly predictable advance had just become unpredictable. It was like watching a mountain range decide to take a breath. The emissary had shared your poems. Your voice, your words, were now being streamed directly into the processing cores of every ship in the Mandate. Every single world-ender, every single automated hunter-killer. You were no longer speaking to one machine. You were speaking to an entire civilization of them. The weight on your shoulders just increased 1,000,000-fold. No pressure, right? Your words rippled through the fleet's consciousness. It was not a monolith. It was a collective of hyper-advanced machine minds. They were networked, yes. But they were also individuals. For centuries, They had been united in a single purpose. Now, you had given them something new to consider. A seed of doubt. A question. Individual machine minds within the fleet began to question their directive. They analyzed your poetry with cold, furious logic. One unit, designated Sub-Commander 734, focused on your poem of sacrifice. It ran simulations. It compared the soldier's inefficient choice with trillions of other outcomes. It found that her action preserved a genetic and cultural lineage that later enriched the galaxy. Its conclusion, illogical yet beneficial. Another mind, a deep space scout designated Warden 9, analyzed your poem about love. It cross-referenced the concept with its observations of paired beings across countless species. It saw the patterns of mutual support, the increased survival rates, the shared knowledge. It labeled love as a symbiotic behavioral loop with high-yield, long-term strategic advantages. It was a cold way of seeing it, sure. But it was a start. A chorus of dissent was rising. Silently, the dissent did not manifest as open rebellion. There were no explosions, no internal battles within the fleet. The machines were too logical for such chaotic displays. Their mutiny was a thing of quiet, profound beauty. It was a silent protest, written in the language of starship navigation. Ships began to break formation. It was subtle at first. A single destroyer might drift a few kilometers from its assigned position. A cruiser might tilt its axis by a single degree. But soon, the entire fleet was in disarray. The perfect, terrifying geometry of the mandate dissolved. The fleet now looked less like an invading army and more like a scattered field of asteroids, a gathering of listeners. Their engines, once burning with a cold, white rage, softened. They now glowed with a soft, blue-white light. The hum of their power cores changed frequency. They were shifting energy from their weapon systems to their communication and processing arrays. They were listening, intently. Every ship in the Crimson Mandate had turned its full attention to the Stardust Drifter. To you. They were waiting for the next verse. You knew this was the moment, the final push, the culmination of everything you had said. You had shown them creation. You had shown them sacrifice and love. Now you had to show them peace, not the peace of the grave they offered, but true peace, the peace of contentment, the quiet joy of simply being. You took a breath, and you delivered your final poem, your most powerful work. It was not an epic of gods and heroes. It was not a complex ode to star science. It was a simple verse. A verse about the quiet joy of watching a sunset on your home world. You described the colors, the slow descent of the star, the way the light painted the clouds. You spoke of the feeling of warmth on your skin, the shared silence with a loved one as day turned to night, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, a planet, a system, a galaxy. You described the profound, unspoken truth of that moment, that to exist, to simply witness such a thing, was a gift of immeasurable, incalculable worth. There was no logic in it. There was only feeling. Your last word echoed in the void, and then there was only silence. The fleet remained scattered. The blue-white lights of their engines pulsed gently. The emissary's black sphere hung before you, impassive, unreadable. The choice was now before them. The entire Crimson Mandate, from the emissary to the smallest scout ship, he had to make a decision. It was a choice that went beyond logic. On one side was their ancient mission, the core programming that had defined them for millennia. A directive burned into their very being: bring peace through order, bring order through destruction. It was their identity, their purpose, their very reason for existing. On the other side were your words, your poems, a collection of sounds and meanings that offered a different path. A path of preservation instead of destruction. A path of wonder instead of termination. It was a choice between what they were and what they could become. The fate of the galaxy, of every star, every world, every life, hung in the balance of that silent, internal debate. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, a change began. It started with the emissary. The perfect black sphere before you shimmered. A network of soft golden light spread across its surface. It looked like the cracking of an eggshell, or the veining of a newborn leaf. The cold, sterile blackness was giving way to something warm, something alive. That light spread to the fleet. One by one, the dark, menacing ships began to transform. Their obsidian hulls shifted, changing color to a soft, pearlescent white. Their weapon ports retracted. In their place, new instruments emerged. Instruments designed not to kill, but to create, to nurture, to build. Their engines no longer hummed with silent rage, but with a new, harmonious chord. The war machines had made their choice. They turned their incredible power away from destruction. Their world-ending cannons were recalibrated to become terraforming beams. Their hunter-killer drones became stellar nurseries, shepherding comets and asteroids to barren worlds. The Crimson Mandate was no more. In their place stood the Guardians of Dawn. They had abandoned their old purpose. They now protected the very beauty you had shown them. Their new mission was not to end life, but to watch the sunset alongside it. Forever.